welcome. I'm David Marin with the League of Women Voters. This is a special presentation on the California statewide ballot propositions covering the November 3rd election in California. I'm joined today by our expert analyst, Judge Melinda Johnson. Judge Johnson, thank you for being with us. What we're going to do in this program and three other ones is look at the ballot propositions. The presentation will be neutral, unbiased. We're trying to look at both sides of each issue. Many of these are very complex laws that are being written, and Judge Johnson is here with us to explain the details. For more information, we always recommend you visit the Secretary of State's website, or you look at the voter information guide that is sent to all voters. That voter information guide includes the pros and cons on each one of these, the ballot arguments that were supplied and the arguments opposing the particular proposition. There's also other links, League of Women Voters and others that'll have more information for you as well. With that, thank you for watching, and we're going to cover ballot propositions 14, 16, and 24 in this segment. Judge Johnson, let's go ahead and start with about Proposition 14. Now, I believe this is the only bond issue on the ballot, and this one is about continuing stem cell research being funded by the California taxpayers. Please explain this one to us.
Historically, most of you will remember that President George W. Bush severely limited federal funding for stem cell research, largely on right-to-life grounds. California stepped in 2000, what year was that?
2004.
Four, and passed a $3 billion bond to allow stem cell research in California. They created the California Institute for Regenerative Medicine. And the first stage of this was essentially basic research. They have spent all but 30 million of their 3 billion, almost entirely on in-state vendors, mostly UC system college universities and Stanford and other nonprofits, a little bit on for-profit companies to do basic research in the area. They're now looking for a $5.5 billion bond to enter the next stage, which would focus a bit more, still doing research, but a bit more on patient access and affordability of treatments, starting to put research into effect.
And stem cell, the idea behind the patients that would be helped by this, what type of diseases are we talking about?
Well, there's a lot of diseases that could be helped. This bill is going to emphasize neurological diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, epilepsy, that kind of thing. That is what the focus, the largest portion of this will be going towards.
And Judge Johnson, this is the only bond. Can you just take a moment to explain a bond versus most of the other propositions, please?
In a bond issue, the people of the state of California are asked to assume debt, which will be payable by the people of the state of California, to fund capital investments. You wouldn't ordinarily have a bond issue to just pay back old credit cards, although we did do that once when Governor Schwarzenegger was in office to catch us up. But generally, it's for some large capital account, school buildings, infrastructure buildings, in this case, research into basic medicinal issues.
And so in this case, it'll be a 30-year payback, and then that 5.5 billion would be estimated to grow to about 7.8 billion.
Correct, with interest. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and a fair amount, I would say. So as far as this one, why are they back? I mean, was the first one in 2004 supposed to solve everything? Or did they have problems, or is it just such an expensive issue?
This is true basic research, and it is very expensive, and it is very long-term. You have to be in it for the long haul. I've had a lot of cases with major pharmaceutical companies. They are routinely prepared to wait 10 to 20 years to see any real significant return on their investment in basic research. So the fact that it's been out there, for even more than a decade should not disappoint. They have some success so far. Hopefully that will build on itself.
One other point I noticed in the arguments for and against is this issue of paying back the taxpayers. So if some of this investment in research pays off by long-term profitability for the pharmaceutical companies, the taxpayers will get a cut of that action. Can you explain a little more about what that is?
That's true. So there is a specifically laid out royalty provision for any product that actually becomes marketable. The state of California will receive a 3% royalty, and then when the sales reach a certain level, they will get a certain multiple of the original grant that was made to whatever institution or entity created the product. And that will continue over time, and in perpetuity, the state will receive royalties from any product or invention which they funded.
And one of the arguments against this is, why is the taxpayer paying about $260 million a year for the state on this bond when private companies can do this work? This is just essentially like another tax on the taxpayers for a very specific interest, and we should not be in this business. We should just let private companies do this. What are some of the counter arguments to that?
And those are legitimate arguments. If you feel that is not the role of the state, that's fine. Private company, this is going to be a long-term and very expensive proposition. You see, we've already spent $3 billion. We're looking at another 5.5. Private entities don't generally have that kind of money. Very few of them do. The public interest suggests that the public body politic might want to have some both say over how research is conducted and have some benefit from it when it's completed. The federal government puts in relatively a small amount. The local entities, the private entities, get some of this contract. We work jointly with them. A public-private joint operation is a very common way to do research in all areas.
Well, thank you. That seems to sum up this particular ballot proposition. If you believe in the state making an investment in research for some very difficult diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson, and others, and then ultimately getting a return from profits, that's one way to vote. If you feel the taxpayer should not really be involved in this kind of thing, and why create another bureaucracy or fund another one, then you might vote against this. We'll leave that to the voters to decide for themselves. Judge Jonathan, let's move on to ballot proposition 16. I'm feeling a little bit of deja vu with this one. It seems like we're back to looking at something we passed a long time ago, 1996, now repealing it. Good arguments for and against. Can you help us understand Prop 16?
So a lot of our ballot this November is an oldies but goodies ballot. You will see revisiting. We're re-upping on a bond that we similarly passed several years ago, and you'll see a lot of revisiting. In 2009, Ward Connerly was the leading voice in creating a proposition, he created Proposition 209, which said the state is prohibited from either discriminating against or giving preferential treatment to anyone because they were a member of a protected category by virtue of their race, sex, color, ethnicity, and so forth. This will amend that to say we will allow diversity, i.e. being a member of a protected class, to be a factor that can be considered in public employment, public education, and contracting decisions. So it's not a complete reversal of Prop 209, but it allows, if you're for it, diversity to be considered. If you're against it, affirmative action to be considered. There's a lot of rhetoric involved in this one.
I see. So at the federal level, there's certain laws regarding this. Can you sort of explain it? Because those obviously must supersede whatever's in our Constitution or removed.
Whenever there is federal funding in any project, there are preferences for minority-owned and female-owned businesses, for example. So in contracting, if there are two people who are essentially equal making a bid, there is a preference to have a minority-owned or female-owned business get the contract. So that does exist when there's federal money.
Now, one of the things is the schools. I think I've seen arguments for and against that before 209, that well-qualified students who just happen to come from privilege or wealth might be excluded from a particular university because they were promoting Latinos or Asians or others of color in a sense. That was sort of, I believe, a rationale that no, we should treat everybody fairly regardless of their ethnicity or background. Now we're going to repeal it. It's still sort of confusing about who really gets preferences.
So This is not a preference initiative. This is I'm going to call it a diversity initiative because that's the word they use. This allows education, employment, and contracting to have as among the factors they considered diversity. There is, among those people who support this, there is a firmly held belief that diversity leads to better outcomes. If you have an educational situation, a classroom where you have all 70-year-old white women, you're going to come out with one outcome as a result of the discussion. And if you have 30 people who are of all different colors and ages and backgrounds, you're probably going to have a more nuanced and sophisticated and thorough study of the question. That's what the diversity is intended to promote. You still can't discriminate against anyone because of their protected class. You can't discriminate against, well, being rich is not a protected class. It's a nice class to be in, but it's not a protected class. But you can't discriminate against someone because of the race, creed, color, and so forth. White or black, any race, creed, or color. You can consider the diversity.
So this is not a quota system. That's a very important thing to clear up. Not quotas. So a university, even if Prop 209 is repealed by passing Prop 16, they're not obligated to change the way that they do admissions.
That's correct. They're permitted to use diversity as one factor. And once Prop 209 passed, they found other ways that didn't involve protected categories to have a more diverse student body. For example, they looked at geography. They looked at whether other people in your family had ever gone to college or were you the first. So they tried to create diversity without violating Prop 209.
One of the arguments that the supporters, or the opponents of this, that would be those who wish to see Prop 209 remain in place. One of their arguments is before 209, that contracts were sometimes given, and these would be for large things, building a freeway or something by the state or local governments, might be given to someone from one of these special classes as far as gender or race, and the state would be paying more money. And if we repeal 209, there'll be this incentive for some state contracting to go to women-owned businesses, and they may charge more than other businesses. Can you help us understand that argument?
Well, I guess I understand the argument. You certainly don't want to pay more just for the benefit of having a female-owned business or a minority-owned business. Generally speaking, those businesses before actually got fewer contracts because they were female or minority owned rather than the reverse. Any government who is letting a contract has an obligation to the people to select the best contract for the best price. Maybe not necessarily the lowest price, but the best contract for the best price. And who the people are who are contracting is now one of the factors that you will consider if this passes.
And that would be up to the government contracting offices. I imagine if at the local level, if your city council wanted to give preferences, they could, or they might be voted out of office if the residents didn't like that. There's nothing in here that forces any municipality or government to do something as far as contracting.
Encourages, but certainly doesn't force.
Okay, but clearly this is something for consumer or voters to think about, whether they want to keep Prop 209. They feel that was a fair thing to have. In that case, they would vote opposing this against Prop 16. Those who think Prop 209 was wrong for the state would vote for 16, so it would be repealed. Judge Johnson, let's move on to something that I wish it was going to be even easier, but I think it's going to be harder than the last one, and that's this Proposition 24. It amends consumer privacy laws. And I'll confess, when I started to read it, I was like, okay, this sounds good. I understand this. And then I was like, no, I guess I don't understand this. And I hope you can help clear us up. So please explain Prop 24.
California is one of the states, and probably the first state, that actually had a right to privacy included in its constitution. We have raised it to that level of importance, which is not in the federal constitution. We have adopted privacy laws. The most recent privacy law was in 2018, and it's about to be kind of put into play. This is intended to beef up the privacy laws for consumers. Every time you go onto the internet and you click on a website, you want to buy a pair of shoes, and within 30 seconds you have ads all over the page you're looking at for shoes very similar to the ones you were looking at. Someone is collecting information about you, sharing it with others who can then use it for advertising or other purposes. One of the truisms is when you use the internet, you are not a consumer, you are the product. Yeah. Your information is what is allowing the internet to be, quote, free to you because it's collected and sold to people for advertising and other purposes. So this is intended to limit the use that can be made, what can be shared, how long what's shared and collected can remain in their domain. It is one of, maybe not the most, but one of the most dense, detailed, and complicated pieces of legislation I've ever read for purposes of ballot propositions. It's 50 pages of very small print. And as my roommate in college used to say, I didn't so much read it, I looked at each word in order, and I did, and I think I understand it, but I also know how much of it is really beyond my ability to understand its true effect.
By that, you mean that, and that would, whether it's you or anyone in the legislature or a judge ruling on something in the future, it's not, I'm taking it that it's not crystal clear what it's trying to do?
Oh, I think it's crystal clear what it's trying to do. It's not crystal clear as to whether each part of it will inevitably lead to that outcome. For example, when someone collects your information on a website where you go to buy something and it's passed on, you have the right under this law to opt out, but that requires a very specific task by you, which is not all that easy to perform. The person collecting it can share it with someone else. So if you're trying to get it deleted or find out more about it, it could be 3 steps down the road. If it's too burdensome for the original collector to contact all those third parties and get them to delete it and so forth, that can be a defense to not having to delete it at your request and so forth. It's, the unintended consequences are hard to predict.
When we look at this, who are some of the organizations or behind it? Is it the private companies like Google and Facebook, or is it more like ACLU and some of those organizations?
Actually, the ACLU opposes it. The primary proponent of this is Andrew Yang, who ran for president, you may remember, and I think he's genuinely well-intentioned. He created a committee and raised money to draft this legislation to try to beef up the existing consumer privacy laws. The ACLU and a lot of other consumer federations are opposed to it. They think it isn't crystal clear. There's too many ways to opt out of for the collectors to avoid preserving our privacy, preserving the limited use to which the data should be used, et cetera.
Well, that's interesting. You're saying the consumer organizations are against this, but usually aren't they lining up for increased privacy?
Yes, they are. That's why the legislation is sufficiently complex. They're concerned, despite its good intent, it can be used for evil.
If it does pass, there'll be changes to the way data is collected by the internet companies in California. I assume it only applies to California.
It does. It has to be collected in California, used in California to come under this rubric.
Is there a downside in a way? I mean, you mentioned possible loopholes and lack of clarity in maybe how the law would be implemented, but is there a grave downside that consumers might be burdened or have to start paying some type of cost to opt out? Is there any regulations like that?
It specifically states that you cannot be retaliated against in any way for choosing to opt out. They can't raise the price of using their website or the difficulty in using their website. A consumer bureau is to be created from this, funded by whatever fines are levied against collectors of data who violate its provisions as best we can understand them. I guess if I were to say there's a downside, if you want more consumer privacy, more control over your sensitive information, Does this move you away from that? It doesn't appear it moves you away from what we have right now. Does it move you forward towards a more coherent and total consumer privacy package? That's the question. That's the question. We can't always solve, this is not a problem that's going to get solved in one piece of legislation. And the question always is, does this move us towards whichever goal we want?
Does this legislation undo some of the legislation that was passed in 2018 by the legislature? Or does it?
It's very hard to tell. When you read the legislation, if you choose to read this legislation that is provided to you by the Secretary of State, you see it in a redlined format. So you see what's eliminated and what's added. The problem is that what's eliminated is often a specific reference to another statute. So to understand exactly what's eliminated or modified, you have to go find that other statute and read it. So yes, it modifies it in some ways, in many ways. Whether it makes it more effective or more difficult or for the collector of information to follow, or more difficult or easy for the consumer to follow, I can't predict.
Sometimes when I look at these, one of my questions is, why are we voting on this? Normally the legislature holds hearings, they have experts come in, and it goes through this kind of collaborative process, perhaps not so collaborative, but there's like a vetting of the laws, and you've talked about 52 pages of fine print. Is this something that has to go to the voters? Could it have been handled by the legislature?
It can be handled by the legislature. And in fact, while you might have a collaborative process, you might in fact have an adversarial process, which often leads to a better outcome as well. That diversity of ideas, not just of race, creed, and color, but a diversity of ideas can sometimes lead to an outcome with fewer unintended consequences. This is the kind of thing I would normally expect to go to the legislature to conduct hearings and so forth. Doesn't have to, but you'll see from its complexity that it's a difficult choice for a consumer who's not a legislative analyst to decide, does this do what I want it to do or move me in the direction I want to go?
I see. Thank you, Judge Johnson. So looking at it in summary, this one, it changes the privacy laws. You can read through the ballot arguments and the summary inside the Secretary of State's Voter Information Guide and come to your own decision whether this is actually moving you forward or backwards in the direction you want to go regarding privacy on the internet. Definitely a very complex one. Allow a few minutes to read this one. With that, we are wrapping up our first program here. We have 3 other programs. I want to thank Judge Melinda Johnson for her expert analysis and helping us get through this. I think most voters are probably like me and not able to read the legal text and truly understand the ins and outs of the law. There are other resources available. The League of Women Voters has several websites, Voters Edge and others. You can learn more about individual candidates on some of those sites. You can learn more about the ballot propositions. There's also information available about voting. And one of the important things with this election, November 3rd, is that all voters will be mailed a mail-in ballot. You don't have to fill out the mail-in ballot. You can still go to a voting center. But if you take advantage of that mail-in ballot to stay safe under COVID, please make sure that you sign it and return it early. I'm David Marin. Thank you for watching, and please watch our other 3 programs on the ballot propositions.